name is Tia Collins. I am an incoming professor at the University of Ottawa in Black Youth Studies in the Faculty of Education. I have a 20-year career in education as a teacher and administrator in various domains. Today I'm going to be talking about my doctoral research, and the title is Black Student Experiences in English Schools in Quebec, and it involves a DisCrit analysis of their special education placement process. The objectives of the study were to document the special education placement process from the institutional point of view, to describe the experiences of Black students throughout that process, and to analyze the systemic and structural barriers that these students encounter throughout the special education placement process. I decided to undertake this study based on my experiences as a professional. I noticed that there were just a lot of disturbing things that I was observing specifically for Black students. DisCrit is an abbreviation for Disability Critical Race Studies. So DisCrit is actually a branch of the larger critical race framework. And one of the fundamental aspects of this framework is really breaking down how dominant discourses don't necessarily reflect the realities of minoritized populations. It was important to make sure that the voices of these minoritized groups were foregrounded, that they were contrasted with the dominant narrative to really bring out things that haven't really been brought to light in research in education in Quebec to date. So I interviewed teachers, principals, guidance counselors, behavioral technicians, and members of a special education placement committee. And the other group was the students themselves. And again, I wanted to specify here the students who self-identified as Black, because often the students are assigned labels, whether it's about special education or whether it's about their personal identity. There's a tendency in Quebec to call these groups ethno-cultural minorities, and maybe place Black students as immigrants, when in fact not all of Black students identify that way. So it's important to bring in that self-identity aspect. Okay, the master narrative, to put it in very short terms, is the dominant narrative. So it's the narrative that is embedded in our culture, that we accept as truth without really questioning it. But what we've been seeing in research is that the voices or the perspectives of the minoritized groups are not always well represented. So it was important to place the master narrative as is, and just to demonstrate that, okay, this is one perspective, but let's see what the actual students are saying, so it emerges as a counter story to that master narrative. From the institutional point of view, the special education placement process is it's a good thing, it's beneficial to students, and we hear the counter story. We hear that students are not exactly in agreement with that position, so they are feeling rather that they are not getting the supports that they need, and that they're living some situations that they think are neglectful, harmful, unjust. Without the counter story, then we would have the impression that everything is operating fine, when in fact we still have a lot of work to do in terms of social justice and just basic services that we're offering to students. The school board personnel and the students Both did say that the special education placement process, it happens when there is a problem, a perceived problem in terms of behavior or in terms of academic performance. So students tend to start off in regular schools, obviously. There's a problem that arises, and it's usually signaled by a teacher based on a teacher's observations. Different phases are then triggered. So students were not necessarily aware that they were being placed. They understood that they were getting kicked out of a regular school, either because there was something to do with their behavior or they were failing. According to the institutional actors, like the school board personnel, that was not ascertained by them. So it's actually a very significant gap in terms of understanding the special education placement process. Because I'm also coming into the research as a practitioner and as somebody who has been working as a teacher, as an administrator, and working very closely with youth, it was really important for me to take into account how sensitive the research was. A lot of stories were told to me that I just wasn't prepared for. And some of them were quite traumatic, and some of them were very hard for the students to recount, but they felt very comfortable telling me the stories. They explained that it was sort of like a therapy for them because nobody ever listened to them. Also, just being from the Black community, understanding that the community doesn't always know or understand what's going on in schools, what their rights are. I felt that it was still necessary to speak to the parents because we know that the parents continue to be marginalized as well. They don't get the information that they need from the schools. And so it was important for me to kind of go beyond what research training was and try to humanize the process as much as possible. The main findings and conclusions in my research were basically that the special education placement process, there are a lot of mechanisms that are hidden in terms of anti-Blackness, in terms of ableism. So there are processes in place that are seemingly, that are appearing beneficial to students, but in fact they are actually doing harm. Another aspect was that the schools that the students were being placed in, once they were placed, they could be very nurturing environments because of their small student-teacher ratio. So it was important for the students that they were able to establish what they were calling real connections, real relationships with the staff. So unfortunately, there's kind of like this a bit of like an oasis period where they're getting this attention that they need, this individualized support, but then as soon as the actual behaviors appear that they were actually placed for, everything breaks down. There was a perception that the students were perceived as adults. So the typical behaviors, like I'm remembering a case where a student threw a juice box and the juice box exploded and made a big mess. These things were taken to the extreme. They were framed as like malicious acts, and they were just kind of very exaggerated and could actually lead to the student being designated with a behavioral problem. There were a lot of criminalizing measures being employed in schools. So I'm talking about physical restraints, I'm talking about forced isolation, I'm talking about calling the police to elementary schools. And this goes again into the adultification. How is it possible to help these students? Well, on the broader scale, we are dealing with a racism denial in this province. So I'm hoping that this can actually contribute to a better understanding of what Black students are going through in schools, a better understanding of how systemic racism works, especially in light of how it is very much concealed through practices and policies. I'm hoping that practitioners can develop a sort of consciousness and really learn to consider some trauma that the students are going through, and it's a very systemic thing. So the systemic trauma of being bullied based on race, of being arrested in an elementary school, and really consider how these things play out and how they might explain some behaviors, and by not necessarily pathologizing these behaviors. Making sure that this information and supports become available to parents so that they don't have to do this on their own, that they don't have to feel intimidated, and that they don't have a voice in their child's trajectory. And finally, what I hope in terms of practice is that we just learn to love Black students more. It's not happening, and they need love, they need nurturing, they need caring, and that is the ultimate goal of this research program, as well as any future research that I intend to undertake.